Mick Napier, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of Stop the JNF, Stop the Jewish National Fund UK. And I'm delighted today to have a couple of guests. Richard Falk has a planetary profile. We'll deal with that later, although I said to Richard earlier, I don't have time to deal with his whole CV. It wouldn't leave time to discuss anything else. We're also delighted to have Courtney Stoddart here from, Richard's joining us from Turkey, but I think Courtney joins us from exotic Edinburgh. Is that right? And Richard, of course, is here to speak about his report for the United Nations on Israeli apartheid. Today or tomorrow, and Courtney, if I got it right, which day is UN Anti-Racism Day? It's today or tomorrow? Do you know which one it is?
I'm not sure actually. Yeah, it could be either. Yeah. Today
or tomorrow. There are those who would think that fighting against apartheid in South Africa or in Israel or wherever is something separate from fighting against the blight of racism here at home. I'm speaking to you from the UK and from Scotland. So Richard and Courtney are here to make that wall unthinkable. Courtney, first of all, Courtney Stoddart, you only started reading poetry a couple of years ago. One of the tasks you set out to do is to puncture myths of Scottish exceptionalism, that we in some way are slightly better than the racism that Black people have to face across the UK. And you've been active in the atrocious case of the murder of a Black man from Sierra Leone, Sheku Boyu, in Fife 5 years ago. So with that, it's a real pleasure to have you here, Courtney. I heard you perform, I saw you at a Black Lives Matter event in Fife, not too far from where Sheku Boyu was killed by the police a couple of years ago. Courtney, you're going to read some poems. I was very impressed and moved by it, but why don't you introduce your poetry and just cut loose?
No problem. Thank you so much for having me here. So yeah, I'm going to do two poems, I think, and the first one is called Skinferiority, and it's basically just a sort of critique of the way that religion has been used as a real tool of colonialism and imperialism. So yeah, I shall begin. So this first poem is called Skinferiority. We deserve more than the gold chains of a new slavery. They want our bodies, want to sell our beings as commodities, mock our hair unless we wear a weave, and won't respect us unless our skin is bleached. Afro is the most natural hairstyle, but for professionals it's deemed as too wild. If you're mixed with white, you can just pass as all right, but you had better be just that extra bit polite, because it's fear that your presence incites. How did the day become afraid of the night, the light become afraid of the dark? Take a look around you, and what do you see? White faces modeled across every city. Can't escape the white supremacy. It's splashed across your TVs and magazines. Say hello to the white Jesus. Hell below. Church say pray on your knees for us. Just believe in us. A white man who came from Palestine. Laughable that this white man turned water into wine. Well, I'll take my turn and I'll pray to the divine, and I'll ask, Father, was it you who created such divide? Told me to turn the other cheek, but take an eye for an eye. Are you taking backhanders from the devil on the sly? I take it that's so you could build your white heaven in the sky. Make us fear death when the most natural thing is to die. Was it you who put a white man's picture on the shrine and said worship? The same God who gave the white man the whip, the quick academic wit to enslave melanated bodies and place them on slave ships. And excuse me if you can't handle it, but this lasting legacy of incessant white supremacy is sick. So where is the remedy? Racism is a disease. So I ask you, God, please, when your missionaries spread the gospel, how was and is it possible to alleviate those responsible for their actions? So contradictory is your philosophy. It's beyond recognizable hypocrisy existing in every colonial faction. Your missionaries quote illiteracy as a signifier of the primitive. Well, God, I pick up my pen, but can you handle it? The words that I write, God, would my words mean more to you if I were white? God, do you know white from wrong? God, have you been white for long? As white as the snow that falls in the Christ masquerade, the ones whose words enslaved and missionaries degrade and spread hate, conditions to manipulate. And I'm sure the Lord knows that the missionary style is referring to rape. The God whose words engraved in the minds and hearts of a people. Inferiority, skinferiority, the God whose Bible dictates that one group is entitled to the Holy Land and murder the Palestinian people on demand. Well, God, if this is your call, then you and the devil must be playing ball. Oh, and God, please explain why your Pope has an upside down cross hanging from his wall. If God is omniscient, he has answers to it all. Love doesn't have a color, so how can a bigoted God designate the melanated people as the other? There is no such thing as reverse racism. It is a fact to say that the original people were black. I understand that white people can sit back, relax, and pay tax, but I refuse to when I'm in a country that chooses to abuse those whose skin does not have a bluish hue. Globally and at home too, and if that's news to you, well, you're thick in the midst of your white privilege. They say ignorance is bliss, and for those that are white, I'm sure it well and truly is. And these words are not to dismiss your experience. Every being's life has worth on this earth, but for what words are worth, believe me, facing daily oppression truly hurts. So I request that you take a step back from your white privilege and question why you're hashtag blessed and who created this. And question the ways in which you're surely, well and truly, perpetuating this. So thank you so much for listening. It's always a bit jarring performing to a phone. It's never quite the same as a live audience in the same way. So Mick, should I just go ahead with my second poem? Yeah, cool. So this one is called Black History, and it's really just my a kind of take on what, this idea of what we think Black history is and how it's so connected to so many other aspects of society in terms of colonialism and how the way that we've been taught to see Black history as almost like separate from other elements of history. When humans have always migrated, that's if there's one thing humans do, it's that they migrate. So yeah, this is really just a little bit about that. So this is Black history. What does Black history mean? Black history is more than mythology and dreams, more than Wakanda memes. Black history is everybody's history, and it seems our world is ripping, tearing at the seams. Can we conceive of alternative reality? Why do we aspire to riches and royalty? We do not need kings and queens, we need revolutionaries. Before slavery, most of us were farmers, storytellers, mystics, and fishermen. Some of us were seers, dreamers, liars, and wicked men. Some of us did ill deeds, and some of us planted seeds. Some died for truth and some killed for lies, and some of us were masterminds never recognized, and there were those who were moral and those who would kill from their own sense of sorrow. Some would beg and some would borrow, and there were teachers, there were painters, there were lovers, and there were haters. There were printmakers, musicians, and critical thinkers, alcohol drinkers. There were saints and there were sinners, and that's what binds us all. We are all flawed, just as we are all full of infinite potential. Our history is not merely consequential. We have been torn down and we've got back up. Some of us have been stuck, feet sinking into mud, and some of us too soft, and some of us too rough, and some of us so hard we won't let in the love and see the system that we have built and envisioned is underpinned by exploitation. So why do we want to emulate the wealth that they have already taken? The corporate media tell you that immigration is something new. But migration is one of the main things that humans do, and corporations go unchecked. They've got a lot to answer for. They're fostering perma-war while we worship celebrities and our appearance overall, and while we like to call it civil, there's no civility in war. People come here seeking refuge, and we show them our closed door, watch their bodies wash ashore, and though publicly we may deplore all wars, it was likely the UK who sold the bombs which hit the floor, perpetually permeating the idea of eternal war. And while they're profiting exponentially, there is no wisdom within war. We forget wealth is not material. It is your integrity and the kindness in your soul. So please, as you grow, don't let it go. Build community, not fake stakes in capital, because when the sun shines, she shines upon us all. You may feel invisible, but visibility does not equal worth. We should not have to fight for our place upon this earth. And remember, your imagination is far more powerful than a rational man's dictation. The banks push inflation until the camel's back is breaking, but we the people are stronger than any nation of all colors and creeds. We were revolutionaries. We were the birds and the bees, the leaves to the trees. Some of us fought against harsh regimes, and there were those who cured disease, and some devoted their lives to religion. Some of us bore children, and some of us were hell-bent, intent on creating division. And today we're sold lies through the television. The imperialist system has swaddled us in materialism, and we fail to question the human condition. We follow the vision of those who cannot see. But we were the heights of glory and the depths of the deepest seas. We were the fair traders and the thieves, loving fathers, mothers, and we were the priests who would deceive. Some of us were cooks, and some of us were cleaners, and some of us had minor misdemeanors, and some of us were prophets, and some of us were university teachers and avid readers, and some of us revered the Orishas, and some of us were poets, writers, and healers. So we don't need to be kings and queens. Let us see the beauty in being revolutionaries beyond all means. Dreams reap and sow them at the seams, and best believe we will be what we were born to be, to love freely, fulfill our destiny. Cause see, those who composed Black history, they were people just like you and me. Thank you so much for listening. So that's all from me.
Don't say thank you. Thank you for coming here, Courtney.
Thanks so much.
And I know you're trying to energize looking at a camera, but if I look at the comments, you've energized a lot of people in a lot of different places. Friend, Courtney, I hope we can continue working together. Stop the GNF is an anti-racist campaign at its core, and you're doing fantastic work. Courtney Stoddart, thank you for joining us today. We'll keep in touch.
Cheers.
Friends, our main speaker today is Richard Falk, and I said to him before we started, we just don't have the time to go through this man's CV. We'd have time for nothing else. He's taught at Princeton for 30 years. From 2008 to 2014, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights in the territories conquered in '67. He was bitterly condemned by the pro-Israel lobby for using the term genocidal tendencies in relation to Israel, as the academics in the field do for all settler colonial projects. And he also used the term state terrorism. He was expelled from Israel as the massacre of 2008, Christmas, New Year, was ratcheting up. And the UK government called Richard's report into the situation in Palestine for human rights unbalanced. That contributed little. He co-authored the report in 2017 on apartheid in Israel, which is the main subject of our conversation tonight. I have to just add one more thing, that Richard happened to be in Scotland at that time when the big news broke. He was due to speak at a meeting in Edinburgh and across Scotland on Palestine, the search for a just peace. that meeting was cancelled by Edinburgh City Council, City Chambers, as too controversial. Richard, how can it be too controversial to talk about the search for a just peace?
Shall I begin?
No, okay. Talk about your report. There's so much to talk about. The report was groundbreaking. It was suppressed by the Secretary General of the UN. You were defended by your immediate superior, Rima Khalaf, I think. It's a groundbreaking report. Some people talk about the dangers of apartheid in Israel, but you're saying something radically different. Richard, tell us what the core ideas of your report were.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. It's good to be back, at least virtually, in Scotland. I enjoyed your hospitality on my last visit. Let me begin by talking about three things that Israel has done since the report was issued in 2017 that makes the contention of an apartheid regime much less shocking to the, what shall I say, the mainstream mind than it had been just a few years ago. And I'd mentioned 2018 basic law that was adopted in Israel, which proclaimed without any embarrassment Jewish supremacy in Israel and asserted that only Jews have a right of self-determination so far as Israel is concerned, and that only Hebrew has the status of being an official language. At least 20% of Israel proper's population is non-Jewish, and it would be much larger had Israel not taken steps initially in 1948, but in ways ever since, to get more land and less Arabs, as it's sometimes summarized the experience. So this kind of open, overt embrace of Jewish supremacy in a modern state has all the inklings of it's not surprising that the leading Jewish NGO, B'Tselem, just a few weeks ago issued its own report and broke with its cautious focus only on specific human rights infractions in the past, and said that Israel, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, was an apartheid state. And that seems to me to be something that really is groundbreaking, in the sense that from within Israel, from an NGO that had been a part of the Zionist project, it was B'Tselem has never separated itself from Zionism. It's been critical of past human rights infractions, but this really is something that I think deserves a lot of attention, that the leading human rights NGO in Israel itself has normalized to the international public and to the US government as such a shocking allegation that it deserved to be regarded as anti-Semitism and as a unambiguously defamatory kind of claim. So there's been, in that sense, a good deal of progress of in what I call the symbolic domain. It hasn't changed the realities that Palestinians are enduring on the ground, either in the occupied territory or in Israel itself or in the refugee camps. Those realities are ever worsening, and just by their being prolonged in time, it's an incredible experience to realize that ever since 1948, large numbers of Palestinians have been confined generation after generation to the humbling and deprived reality of being refugees, denied the right to return to their own native land.
Can I just say that, I mean, the movement by B'Tselem is fantastically significant, but you and Virginia Tilley were 4 years ahead. Do you think if your report came out today, it might be received any differently, Richard?
Well, I think it would be a little bit more difficult to pretend to be so shocked by the analysis that our report had. Of course, the report itself had the major effect of being widely discussed in academic circles and in activist groups. And in a way, Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador who attacked me personally in the Security Council and attacked the report and demanded that the Secretary General repudiate the report, she was an unpaid publicity agent for us. I mean, because it gave the report a kind of prominence and salience it would not have probably received had it not been treated in this high-profile manner. And I should also mention that there's a major difference between our report and the B'Tselem assessment, and for that matter, the 2018 Basic Law in Israel. Our report makes the contention based on Israeli policies and practices that it is the entirety of the Palestinian people, not the territory on which Palestinians are now confined. So in other words, it extended the reach of apartheid non-territorially to the refugee camps and to involuntary exiles denied a right of return. And we felt that was extremely significant in terms of the existential reach of the apartheid system that Israel had imposed on the Palestinians in conditions that had many fundamental resemblances to apartheid in South Africa, but also had significant differences, one of which was this issue of who suffers from this apartheid regime. And I think that our assessment that it is the people that one should be looking at in this case, because Israel, in order to sustain its pretension of being a democratic state, had to get rid of as many Palestinians as it could so that it could approach being a majority Jewish state when the partition resolution of the UN was adopted and the supposed two-state partition of historic Palestine was decreed. Israel, at that time, when the partition resolution was passed, it was still less than 50, considerably less than 50% of the population, and that was intolerable. And from the beginning, the first leader of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said, "The Bible shall be our weapon in securing the whole of the promised land, not just the land that was conferred by the partition resolution, which Israel pretended to accept as a solution and a compromise, but only on the public relations front. It actually always held this biblical claim of entitlement to the promised land. And Ben-Gurion said it very explicitly. He said, "The Bible shall be our weapon." And what he meant, even though he was very non-religious himself, he saw that the Zionist project had no legal or moral foundation for claiming the whole of Palestine.
Which gave rise to the Zionist quip that there is no God, but he gave us the land, yeah?
Yes, exactly. I hadn't heard that before. But if you recall, the original Zionist success was with the Balfour Declaration back at the end of World War I in 1917, but that promised Jews only a homeland. There was no commitment to a Jewish state. And in fact, there was a lot of opposition within the British colonial elite to allowing a Jewish state to be established. So that one has to understand that at every stage in the existence of the Zionist undertaking, it got what it could effectively seize at that moment, but always kept its eye on a much more ambitious goal. And that ambitious goal was to establish a Jewish state in the entirety of Palestine, despite the fact that it was an Arab society, a non-Jewish society. And the necessity of apartheid arises from the fact that you cannot expect a native population to allow in the 21st century, the time when colonialism was being defeated all over the world, to allow that to happen unless extreme force is used to suppress national resistance. And so when you combine the ethnicity of this form of settler colonialism with the historical circumstance that colonialism was dying all over the world, the emergence of an apartheid regime was almost built into the project. And as I say, it's significant that it's only recently come to the surface of Israeli formal policy. And I wanted to mention just the last thing about what Israel has done itself to make this apartheid contention much more, what shall I say, much more part of a discourse that's difficult to refute. And that is the imposition of what's being called medical apartheid, denying Palestinians access to the vaccine while boasting to the world that it is the most vaccinated country in the world, and even engaging in vaccine diplomacy of sending vaccines to a series of countries, Denmark, Honduras, Guatemala, and I think one other country. So it uses this vaccine as a diplomatic instrument, denying Palestinians, which are suffering a surge at the present time in the occupied territories, from access really total access. And this has been accentuated by the fact that Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem have been given privileged access to the vaccine. So it really does reinforce the contentions that this is a racial divide, an ethnic divide that is highly discriminatory, victimizes the Palestinian people, and violates one of the most fundamental duties of Israel as the occupying power, which is to protect the health and well-being of the occupied society. And there are even provisions in the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 50 and 55, which use the word epidemic, that there's a special duty of the occupying power at a time of a health crisis and an epidemic is given as an illustration to protect, as to the extent capabilities allow, the health and well-being of the population so suffering.
Richard,
So
can I move you? Sorry.
No.
I'll let you finish before I try to move on.
Yes, I think it's important to appreciate these background factors. You know, it was only in 2013 that John Kerry, the then Secretary of State of the Obama presidency, told the Israelis, if you don't take this last opportunity to make peace under the Oslo diplomacy, you will become an apartheid state. That's they already were an apartheid state, but even so, it was treated as a very provocative statement, and to the displeasure of many, Kerry actually apologized for the remark and walked it back, so to speak.
Yeah.
So we've come a long way, I think, but it's a long way in symbolic politics. It hasn't yet been translated into a substantive change in the balance of forces that subject the Palestinian people to this continuing regime of multiple forms of victimization.
Thanks, Richard. Before moving on to talk specifically, if we may, about the JNF and the role of the Jewish National Fund as a pillar of Israeli apartheid, can you just can we just get rid of a couple of things? Israel's not an apartheid state because it's not like South Africa. It's not an apartheid state because people can vote. It's not an apartheid state because people don't have separate benches and separate toilets. Can we just clear that away before we start to talk about the JNF, Richard?
Yes, I think that there's a 1973 International Convention on the prevention. It makes a point of not tying the concept of apartheid to the South African origins of the notion. There's no doubt that South Africa originated this form of systematic racial domination that is rationalized by a racist ideology. But it was clear at that time, and then in the drafting of the statute of the Rome Statute that governs the International Criminal Court, apartheid is listed without any reference to South Africa as one of the crimes against humanity. And so I think it's a frivolous distraction to say that Israel's form of racially configured domination within its state and beyond is not a form of apartheid that qualifies under international criminal law as such.
You're hosted by Stop the JNF. We focus on the Jewish National Fund, because we think it's a pillar of Israeli apartheid, but it's also by organizing around the world in civil society in about 50 countries, we think it's vulnerable to pressure and to campaigning. Do you think we've got that right, Richard?
Yes, I mean, there are different pressure points that could be chosen, and it may depend on the conditions within a particular society. And maybe in this case, I'm not as informed as I should be, but it would be a appropriate tactic anywhere in the world, and complements BDS, the BDS campaign, and other nonviolent forms of pressure that are exerted in a situation where both the UN and the governments of the world have proved incapable of finding a just and sustainable peace after more than 70 years of seeking to do that. It's up to the mobilization of civil society, global solidarity initiatives, plus Palestinian resistance efforts to create the foundations for an eventual peace that treats both peoples equally.
Now, Richard, you're in Virginia Tilley's groundbreaking report was about Israeli an apartheid system, a state-enforced racism, not just operating in the West Bank, but across the whole of Palestine. That the green line, in a sense, it wasn't obliterated, but it wasn't as important as some people thought it was. The JNF recently has come out and removed the mask and said that they're funding initiatives, part of the ethnic cleansing program in the West Bank, in the territories conquered after 1967. They kind of drew a veil over that in the past. Do you think that tactically, do you think that makes them more vulnerable to pressure, given that most governments still stand by the fiction of a two-state solution, the idea that on one side of the green line, something is criminal, which is not on the other? Do you think this openness on the part of the GNF, this confidence that they're operating right across the whole of historic Palestine, do you think that changes things at all?
I think it has a relevance. I mean, the B'Tselem report also departs from the idea that they're dealing only with apartheid within Israel. They say Israel de facto is one state at this point, and that the laws of Israel and the discriminatory policies and practices don't differentiate between the territory that's on either side of the green line. In other words, it's a unified reality, and it should be viewed in that way. And therefore, what is done that is rejected in the occupied Palestine is indicative now of what happens within Israel itself. And the fact that the GNS comes to this, sort of shares this view at this time, in reverse in a way, suggests that it no longer is meaningful to talk about the separation of the occupied West Bank from Israel, and therefore the whole convenient political fiction of a two-state solution is really a cruel distraction that's allowed the settlement phenomenon to expand and allowed Israel to mitigate the pressure on it to withdraw from the occupied territories until it's made it completely unrealistic to withdraw, because it has upwards of 500,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Netanyahu is just pledged to legalize the so-called unlawful outposts, the settlement outposts that were unlawful even under Israeli law. And there's every indication that Israel has no intention whatsoever of withdrawing from the most valuable and largest parts of the West Bank, and no intention to allow East Jerusalem to become a capital of a Palestinian political entity.
Richard, we've got you coming in from Turkey. You're something of a figure in the field of international law, having taught such subjects at Princeton. Now, in this country, we have people who can be produced, who can come forward with legal opinions that say the invasion of Iraq is legal. You know, we've got people here who are really, they can prostitute themselves, but you haven't done that. The last talk we had for Stop the GNF was Michael Fischbach, who was talking about reparations, who was talking about the possibility of exerting pressure on the GNF. He used interesting examples from Cuba, where the US State Department has demanded that property rights have asserted that property rights there were not extinguished by the revolution, and they insist on American owners being restituted. He mentioned Cyprus as well. What's your view of the argument that property rights, property pillaged by the Israeli state and now in the hands of the GNF, remains the property of the Palestinians from whom it was pillaged, that their property rights have not been annihilated by the passage of 70 years? Could you comment on that, Richard? I think it's a very important issue.
I think it is a very important issue, but I wouldn't put it ahead of trying to find a humane solution for the underlying victimization of the Palestinian people. That those hundreds of thousands, those millions really, who've been living generation after generation in refugee camps and who are subject to this oppressive form of occupation and are discriminated against in Israel. I think once you remove that atrocity generating structure of control, then you can begin to approach issues that will allow the people to reconcile, to overcome the injustices of the past. And certainly high on that list was the confiscation and exploitation of Palestinian property ownership. And that should be either restored in some way or some kind of program of reparations should be given serious consideration. I haven't really devoted attention to that in the Palestinian context. I agree that it has a great relevance for Black Americans with the heritage of slavery and racism in our country, and Cuba has been subject to these very punitive sanctions for almost a century now, or at least less than a century, but 80 years anyway. And you can make the case that Iran and Venezuela are suffering now from unlawful and very damaging sanctions for the health and well-being of civilian population. And then Iraq during the 1990s lost hundreds of thousands of people, died apparently as a direct result of the sanctions imposed after the first Iraq War in 1991.
Thank you, Richard. Shan asks if you have an opinion on the increasing extremism of the Israeli government, the sharp moves to the right, do you think it's a sign of desperation or hubris, confidence, or lack of it?
I think it's hard to reduce it to one explanation. I think it may be best understood as part hubris and part desperation. And as I've been trying to emphasize, I think there is a growing desperation on the level of symbolic politics. And it was reinforced by this International Criminal Court decision of February 5th, which really gave this institution, this International Criminal Court, the authority to investigate crimes committed by Israeli leaders, military and political leaders since 2014 in Gaza and in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And that, if nothing else happens, that's an enormous defeat symbolically for Israel. And it resorts to defaming the institution and calls a very careful, legally reasoned decision pure anti-Semitism in Netanyahu's words. And that's analogous to the kind of defamation that I and others were subjected to, because Israel doesn't have really substantive responses to these allegations that will stand up to scrutiny. So it's better to attack the messenger than address the message. And that's a shift. And that's where I say the desperation comes. The hubris comes, it's a sort of legacy of the Trump years in relation to the US and the seeming geopolitical continuity that has been expressed so far by the Biden presidency, really not reversing what the damages that Trump did. And it's a disappointment, not exactly surprising, because I think Biden wants to leave the foreign policy issues aside while he tries to deal with the health issues and the economic recovery of the US, and doesn't want to be distracted by antagonizing the Jewish lobby or the Republicans that are more pro-Israeli than most of the Democrats. And even some of the Democrats would be antagonized by a so-called even-handed approach, whatever that is.
Richard, Annie asks how you see the ICC proceeding with this case. But my extra question is, do you expect to be called as a witness? If you were called as a witness by the ICC, would you be happy to provide testimony? But how do you see this proceeding?
I've been involved already to the extent of submitting an amicus brief with Al-Haq, the collaboration with Al-Haq, the human rights organization, very good human rights organization in the West Bank. As I said in my prior response, the ICC decision is a huge symbolic victory for Palestinian people and should give confidence to the global solidarity movement that it's on a path that deserves strong support. There's a new prosecutor that succeeds Fatou Bensouda, and who comes from the UK actually, and is a sort of controversial character. We don't know what his approach to this investigation will be, We don't know whether he would be inclined to include apartheid in the inquiry into criminality. We do know that the preliminary examination of Israeli crimes included the excessive use of force to the right of return demonstrations at the Gaza border and during the protective edge attack on Gaza in 2014 and the expansion of the settlements in this period. It's also, the investigation includes allegations that Hamas rockets were indiscriminate and therefore violated the law of war. And so it's possible that one will get investigation that indicts Hamas leaders more than it involves Israeli leaders. We don't know what the future. That would be ironic and contrary to the weight of evidence and the weight of casualties caused by these different crimes. But it's politically possible, given the pressure that the US and some of the European countries have been exerting on the ICC.
Richard, before I let you go, could we agree? And if you say it's going to work, then I'll use it. Is it useful to think of apartheid, wherever it appears, as state-enforced racism, as opposed to the racism that blights so many societies, possibly all of them? Is the key idea that it's enforced by the state, residential, economic, political, and so on? Have I got that right?
Yes, it's right, although it does invite a maybe diversionary discussion, because I think systemic racism, for instance, in the US, wouldn't be viable if there wasn't some state complicity. So the state is always in some way implicated, even if it's implicated only to the extent that it tolerates societal modalities of racism. And so I think I wouldn't, what differentiates Israel, in my view, is the severity and the explicitness of this kind of state-enforced racism that is even given an ideological validation in the Basic Law of 2018 and extended beyond the sovereign territory of Israel to make miserable the lives of Palestinians who are in refugee camps and in exile. So I think it's an important term to use, and I would argue there will be no sustainable peace between the two peoples until apartheid is dismantled. And in that regard, one can learn a lot from the South African experience, both in the recognition that if they wanted to have a peaceful relationship and not be a pariah in the rest of the world, they had to dismantle apartheid as a precondition. The leaders there didn't wake up with a moral illumination one day. They calculated they were better off making this what seemed like a dramatic adjustment rather than facing global solidarity pressures and internal resistance opposition. So I think that what one hopes for is that the Israeli leaders will come to that kind of conclusion, but they won't come to it unless the peoples of the world exert the pressure. The governments have shown no credibility in creating the kind of pressure that would make for change, nor has the UN been able to mobilize a sufficient authority to make changes substantively?
Richard, they would make very fine concluding remarks, but can I ask you to make some concluding remarks? It's getting up to the top of the hour. You and Virginia Tilley have produced a scholarly work. It's not a polemic. Who has engaged with it to try to challenge the content and the reasoning within it? You've concluded, you've pointed out that if the label of apartheid is to stick, this constitutes a crime against humanity. That has to make life easier and better for those fighting Palestinian freedom. Can you answer those 2 points, Richard, and make some concluding remarks?
The 2 point, I didn't.
Who has engaged with the content of your report and tried to deal with the substance of it, as opposed to calling you a Jew hater? And secondly, once you've achieved that, the conclusions that you did, and point out that apartheid is a crime against humanity, that can change things, can't it, for campaigners internationally?
Yes. Well, let me say, and I regard it as significant, that there has been no effort at a respectable refutation.
Nothing.
Nothing that I know about. Maybe
not a sausage. Nothing at all. Yeah. Okay.
And it's consistent with what I was saying earlier, that Israel prefers now not to deal with substantive issues. They prefer to defame and smear and attack international institutions and divert. It's what I've called in my UN reports the politics of deflection. You make people, you try to make people look where you want them to see, rather than what should be seen, which is the essence of these criminal arrangements that have been suppressing the Palestinian people for decades and allowing Israel to expand and the Zionist project to realize its earlier grandiose ambitions. So I think there's no question in my mind that a refutation would be very thin in its capacity to refute. Some people have sort of in passing said, well, you can make the argument. The argument is pretty clear for occupied Palestinian territory, but it doesn't hold up for Israel because it has elections, it has a certain level of judicial independence and certain kinds of freedoms that are enjoyed by the Palestinian people. And I think that's the most difficult part of our argument, is the extension of the apartheid claim to the Palestinian minority living in Israel proper. But I think if you read the report fairly, it's pretty convincing on that weakest link in the apartheid chain, so to speak. As far as the other part of the question was to, what was that?
It's the symbolic importance and how naming something like this can shift the balance to some degree, Richard.
Yes, well, we don't know to what extent it will shift the balance. It already has been adopted very widely in activist circles. And our report, as I said, has gotten a dissemination and acceptance that we never expected. We're hoping to turn it into a book, but like many people, we hope for things that don't happen so quickly. but I think it's, as I say, it's crucial if you want to have a just and sustainable peace to look at the apartheid angle, because there's no way to get to a peaceful endpoint unless you dismantle apartheid. And that should be the cardinal lesson of the South African antecedent. And the second lesson is that what the global solidarity movement combined with South African resistance activity could be done in relation to Israel also.
Richard Falk, on behalf of Stop the JNF UK and International, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. We hope after lockdown you may actually visit us in the flesh. Can you tell us just the title of your new memoir, your autobiographical piece?
Yes, my new memoir is entitled Public Intellectual, The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim, and it tries to deal with the interface between my personal life, my professional life, and my political life, which concerned issues other than Israel-Palestine. The Vietnam War was my activist baptism, so to speak, and I was very involved. I happened to be in Iran at the time of the Iranian Revolution and had the opportunity to have a long meeting with Ayatollah Khomeini. And so I try to deal with these experiences and how they affected my thinking about world issues in the midst of a effort to integrate it with my private life.
Well, Richard, all too many academics fail to integrate in a sensible way, but the way you've done it includes a very large dose of courage as well as intellectual smarts. Richard Falk, again, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to keeping in touch going forward. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Mick. It was my pleasure to be with you.
Friends, just a couple of announcements. Our next speaker will be Khalil Alamour, who's a Palestinian Bedouin who'll be speaking to us on April the 3rd, first day in April at 4 p.m. UK time, on the role of the JNF in the ethnic cleansing of the Nakab, otherwise known as the Negev. And I think that will be a very significant contribution to the discussion. They're suffering massive effort at ethnic cleansing on behalf of the Israelis. So please join us again on April the 3rd. Courtney Stoddart's poetry is wonderful and it's available. Look, this is the age of the internet. You can easily beat a path to her wonderful poetry. I think I read it, I think I viewed it as part of the Edinburgh Book Festival, some Scottish Book Festival. You can find it if you make the effort. Please support Stop the JNF. The JNF is a pillar of Israeli apartheid. It does operate probably in your jurisdiction. You can make a difference. Get in touch with Stop the JNF. Canada, South Africa, Britain, Germany, Chile, Argentina, etc. And offer your intelligence and some of your energy to this noble struggle. This is Mick Napier again on behalf of Stop the JNF, thanking our hundreds of people in many countries across the world and especially in the UK for joining us today.